why does God allow bad things to happen? So how should we respond to that, or what would be the answer?
The first thing, especially with a question like that, the first thing I would ask would be, did you have something particular in mind, like some particular evil? And the reason why I would ask that is because sometimes people are asking this question because they're suffering
Mm,
and they're in a lot of pain, and maybe they're questioning the existence of God because of that pain. And if that's why they're asking the question, you really need to be sensitive to that, because if you start giving really philosophical, intellectual answers and you're not addressing their pain, it could really not go over well. Now, sometimes they just have an intellectual question. Maybe an atheist has challenged them about this and they're confused. They don't know how to answer. And that kind of you can adjust your answer based on where they're coming from. So you kind of want to find out what is going on with them and why they're asking the question. But there are a couple things to keep in mind for the answer to this question. And the first thing is that God's goal is not our comfort. And this is something that we as Christians, especially in this country where things go pretty well for us
right. Yeah.
compared to other places and other times,
Yeah.
we start to think that if we do everything right, then everything's going to go right for us. God's going to look out for us. We can trust him. They think that trusting God means I trust that nothing bad's ever going to happen to me. Well, of course, when something bad happens, you're shattered because you weren't prepared. And I think we all have to go through that, because even if in our minds we think, no, I know that's not true, you still
Right.
kind of feel like it's true.
Yeah. You too.
And so when things start to go bad, the thing to remember is that God's goal is not our comfort. Now, we know this is the case because if you look in the Bible, what you're going to see is that God's people have suffered a lot from beginning to end.
Yeah.
So we can't be surprised if we suddenly enter into some suffering or something bad happens to us. It's been happening all along. So what we need to understand is, what is God's goal for us? If it's not our comfort, there's something more important than our comfort. And I think we find this in, I'm just going to read this. We find this in Romans 8. Now, we all are very familiar with Romans 8:28, which says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And then we say, oh, okay, yeah, see, my good. Everything's going to go right for me. Well, not exactly, because we need to know what God means by our good.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to do us good? And the next verse says, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son. That is the good God is working towards. He's working to conform us to Jesus's image.
Mm-hmm.
And to accomplish that, I think suffering often plays a part. Because when we suffer, we learn a lot of things. We learn to trust God. We learn to be dependent on him. We learn about his character. Our character changes. We learn what's important. There are a lot of different things that God uses to shape us through suffering.
Right.
Now we can all think of scenarios where a parent will intentionally cause pain to their child, like a shot or
Mm-hmm.
some sort of punishment or but even a shot, obviously shot has nothing to do with punishing them.
Right. Yeah.
It's actually there to help them. And so I think we need to see suffering in that light, that because we know God's character and we know who he is and we know that he loves us, we know that everything is working for our good, and we know that good is making us like Christ, we can start to think about our suffering in that way. And that doesn't mean that we're going to know exactly why something happened. Like, I can't look back and say, okay, this terrible thing happened to me, and now I know it was because of this. Well, sometimes you'll know, and sometimes you won't know.
Yeah.
It just, you won't know every time. This reminds me of a story about Corrie Ten Boom. Are you familiar with Corrie Ten Boom?
Yeah.
Okay, so for anyone who hasn't heard of her, she was someone who lived in the Netherlands and she hid Jews during World War II. And then she ended up in a concentration camp. And she and her sister were in their barracks and they got there and there were tons of fleas. And her sister said, okay, well, let's thank God. And Corey's like, what?
Right.
There's no good reason for fleas. Are you crazy?
Yeah.
That's crazy. But she thanked God for, everything anyway. And, or she thanked God for being in it. I don't think we have to thank God for evil that happens to us. I don't want people to get me wrong there, but she assumed God had a purpose for it. And so she and her sister started having these worship services in the barracks, and the guards would never come in.
Right.
They didn't know why. They just kept having these services. The guards never came in, and they're like, why isn't this happening? Well, I don't know. And then one day somebody tried to bring a guard in for another reason, and the guard refused to come in because of the fleas.
Yeah.
So that was a situation where ultimately she was able to see why something happened.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I do think sometimes we do see why things happen. And so when that happens, we need to take note of that and remember it for the times when we don't know why that something happened.
Yeah.
And one other thing I like to keep in mind, and I always bring up this easy thing to remember when we are suffering, because I think it really helps us to put things into perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think we need to do is look at Jesus on the cross. So obviously he was suffering, but there are things we learn about God by looking at the cross that can help us in our suffering. And the first thing is we see on the cross God's sovereignty and his wisdom, because he brought that about. He brought this cross, this whole situation about by moving history along, by bringing the Messiah. But, he go way back. He promised to bring a Messiah at the very beginning after we fell, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he created Israel. He brought had all of this happen. He brought about the cross and he saved us. Now that takes sovereignty and that takes wisdom. So we know, okay, I'm going through suffering, but God knows that and God is sovereign. So it's not, things aren't out of control. So that's the first thing that helps. And secondly, we see God's love for us, because there is Jesus dying on the cross in horrible pain for us. So I don't know how else he could prove
Right. Yeah.
how much he loves us, right? Because that's the other thing. When we are suffering, when bad things happen, we think, okay, maybe God doesn't love me. No, look at the cross.
Right.
We'll
Yeah.
see God's love there. So we see his sovereignty and his wisdom, and we see his love. We also see his power because God raised Jesus from the dead.
Right.
So
Yeah.
when you put all of these things together and you're thinking about your own suffering and pain and evil things that happen to you, and you think, okay, God's sovereign, so this situation's not out of his control. He loves me, so he hasn't forgotten me. And he's powerful, so he could change this at any time, and he's not. So if he's not changing it and he loves me and he can change it, that means there's a reason.
Right.
And then we can trust, okay, there's a reason for this. I don't know what it is, and I won't maybe until after I die, but I can trust God because he's proved himself to be sovereign and loving and wise and powerful. And what I always say at that point, if we know that all these things are working for our good, there's nothing more evil can do to us, because everything that's happening is working towards our good. God is working everything towards our good to make us like Christ. And that's something that we can rest in. And so that just the cross and thinking about the cross is a really easy thing to remember when you're going through suffering.
Mm-hmm. I liked how you you brought it back to, or you centered it around the attributes of God. You talked about His
Mhm.
sovereignty, His power, His love. I think the more we learn about, who God is, the more we can be comforted, in our different life situations.
And one more thing to add to that, when we think about why we're going through suffering, it is to make us like Christ. But ultimately, even above that, I think it's to help us to know God.
Mhm.
And when we think, "Oh, why is there a fallen world?" Well, if the world had never fallen, we wouldn't have the cross. We wouldn't be able to see God's grace. We wouldn't understand what it means to get forgiveness and for God. We wouldn't see His love for enemies if there were no enemies. So
Right.
all of these things are playing a part in helping us to know God better. And if that's God's ultimate goal, He wants to show us His kindness for all eternity, is what Ephesians says.
Mm. Right.
And the better we know Him now, the more we will enjoy Him later. And so all of these things are working towards those beautiful things. Now, there's a really good book by Randy Alcorn called If God is Good: Faith in the Midst of Suffering and Evil. And when I read that book, he has so many stories about people who suffered really difficult things.
Mhm.
And then he talks about how the people say they're not sorry it happened. They're actually grateful that they went through it because of, and then they explain how
Yeah.
they know God better now. That just overwhelmed me because that's when I realized, oh, this kind of the sheer number of stories kind of drummed it into my head finally. Oh, okay, God is working through this. He really is working through this. Now, if anyone gets that book, don't be scared. It's very long. Don't be scared. The chapters are really short and it's very readable. And that's something I definitely recommend when you're thinking about suffering and evil.